Good afternoon, guys. Today, I want to talk about self-perception and the psychology of power. I'm going to address a question which is, what is the effect of power and how does it change how we connect with others? Let me start with actually an anecdote. It's a picture from my holidays. Don't worry, the whole slideshow is not about my holidays. As a psychologist, I got the chance to visit in Africa a remote tribe. A tribe from the Maasai warriors that barely see other human beings. And it was fascinating to me because I always thought that these are the guys that bind together. These are the guys that feel all connected because they're part from what we call a very collectivist cultures, and these are the ones that really are similar to others and love being similar to others. And I met Meye Kuhaya. That's Meye Kuhaya. Meye Kuhaya was wearing sneakers. Meye Kuhaya had a mobile phone, so not exactly the kind of Maasai warrior I was expecting to meet. And I talked to the guys around and I say, what about this guy? And the people I met from the tribe were saying, oh yeah, he always wants to be different. He always wants to show that he's got the latest things and so on. And I thought, that's not really what I would have been expecting from someone in an African tribe. And it started to drive this curiosity as a researcher as to, is there some kind of human universal that changes how we connect to others? Is there something that actually gets in the way of our feeling connected to others? And that's when I started researching how power gets in the way of how we connect with others. So there are three questions I want to address in this talk. First of all, what makes us feel psychologically connected to others? How does it come about that we feel disconnected or psychologically connected with others? Then, how does power get in the way? How does power changes how we function, how we process information, and how does it hurt the way we connect with others? And third, what can we do about it? Now that we know that power actually gets in the way, what can we do to avoid these negative effects? So let's start at the beginning and at an early age. If you look at this kid on the picture, he doesn't look very happy about what's in the plate. You've got two different ways of talking to that kid, two different types of discourses that can change the way that kid will develop a sense of connection. So if you're from the West, if you're from the Western world, typically you tell that kid, oh, eat the vegetable, you'll become bigger, you'll become tall, you'll become strong. So you're emphasizing what makes that kid unique and different from others. You can also say things such as, for instance, think about children in Africa. Think about how lucky you are to be different from them, disconnected from them, because you have food and maybe some of them are starving. But if you look at what people say in collectivist cultures in the East, it's a completely different vibe. It's a completely different dialogue. They would say things such as, think about how upset mummy or daddy is that you're not eating what's in the plate. Or things such as, think about the farmer who works so hard for you to be able to have these vegetables in your plate. Think about how upset the farmer would be. So what you're doing with these dialogues is insisting on connections. What makes people feeling psychologically connected to the rest of society. And Marcus and Kitayama, researchers from the US and Japan, were the first ones to get interested in what makes us feel connected and disconnected from others. And what they found is that people from Western cultures tend to develop this kind of what they call independent self-control, that is, I'm unique and different from others. And that's my primary way of seeing myself. Whereas in the Eastern world, it's the other way around. Is I'm connected to others, and my relationship with others, my similarities to others, is what drives me in life and society. And we both need a sense of independence and a sense of interdependence, but depending on the context, depending on the culture, we're going to feel more or less connected with others. Now, it gets reinforces as we grow along. So the toys we play with, what we call the socialization practices, how we're taught to behave, reinforces these behaviors. So boys are encouraged to be strong. Boys don't cry. Boys shouldn't show their emotion. They should be strong and independent. Girls are encouraged to socialize. Girls are encouraged to share their emotion, to care for others, and that's how they all end up, girls always go to the loo together, and I've never been able to explain that. But it's not only about gender practices, it's also about how we grow and our age. So when we are young, we are interdependent. We're naturally connected to others because we need others. We need our parents to take care of ourselves. We need our parents to actually help us dress and so on. And then we grow as adults. What is it about, when you grow up as an adult? It's about becoming independent. It's about breaking free. So our independent self becomes stronger as we become adults. And then along the way, when we age, we start being in need of others again. So we become interdependent again. But apart from these life stages, there is something big that can get in the way. That's not Barack Obama, but that's what he represents. Power. What do psychologists think about power? Well, power is the capacity to influence others and to stay uninfluenced from others. Power is the control that we have over resources, be them financial or be their own any other types of resources. Power can come from many different ways. It can come from, for instance, the authority that we have in a company, being in a certain position, but it can also be a sort of expertise. I'm an expert, therefore I've got expert power, I can influence others. And psychologists have been fascinated by power and what it does to us. One of the first thing that power does is it changes our capacity to step into the shoes of the other, to see and understand what the other person is seeing. So you see in that picture, we've got two persons looking at the same thing, but they're seeing different things. If you've got the capacity to step into the shoes of the other, to take the perspective of the other, then you understand that they see something different and that it is normal. Now, researchers at Galinsky and some colleagues did a fascinating piece of research that is published in Psychological Science a few years ago, whereby they asked people to write a little story either about when they were in power or when they were not in power. This is in psychology what we call priming, a temporary shift in how you feel, either powerful or powerless. And then they paired people in their experiment doing little games where they had to write letters on their forehead. What they found is that the people who had to write a story when they were in power were less likely to write a letter that would be readable by their partner. So like what you see on the left-hand side. People who were writing a story about when they had no power were more likely to take the perspective of the other and write their letter on their forehead that was readable by the partner. And that's the first big thing about power and how we connect to others. Power makes us less capable of empathizing and of taking the perspective of the other. Powers actually do other stuff even on our brain. So Kaltner and colleagues at the University of California, for instance, investigated the effect of power on our brain. And what they found is that when we are in situation of power, the effect of this in our brain can be comparable to little brain traumas. In other words, we end up doing things that some people that have brain traumas do, such as swearing, such as being more likely to display bad table manners, such as being loud, interrupting others. So power really disrupts our behaviors, and it disrupts the capacity that we have to monitor our behaviors. We care less about others, we care less about the consequences of our acts onto others. Now, power is not just for the bad. Researchers in psychology found that power and being in power helps us to focus. It helps us to focus on key information, and it makes us less distracted by peripheral information. So it's not just for the bad. But on our quest to research the psychology of power and how it makes us feel more or less connected, we decided with colleagues to investigate a very hierarchical environment, which were hospital settings. And what we did is we looked at the self-perception of two different categories of people at the hospital, which were doctors and nurses. And we surveyed them, and we used measured from the literature to measure their sense of independence and their sense of interdependence, so how connected they felt to others. And what we found was quite interesting. First of all, doctors. They had a predominant sense of the self that was about independence. They felt unique and different in the hospital setting. Nurses, on the other hand, they were balanced. So they neither felt too independent nor too interdependent, unlike doctors that felt really independent. But what was most fascinating about our research was the differences in terms of gender and how power affects different types of people in different types of position differently depending on whether they're men or women. And what we found is that when you give power and status to men, they feel less interdependent, they feel less connected to others. If you give power to women, it's the other way around. Women in power tend to feel more connected to others. So in our sample, for instance, men doctors were feeling less connected to others than men nurses. And it was the other way around for women. Female doctors felt more connected with their patients and the team than the female nurses. So what does it mean? Now that we know that power does not only good to us, because it interfere with how we interact with others. It interferes with what and how we connect with others. What is the solution? That's the third point of the talk. Well, it's all about mindfulness. In the research we do, we teach people to be aware of the consequences of power. If you know the consequences of power, if you know what power does to you, you're actually able to counterbalance the negative consequences of power. So among the games that we do, for instance, the first one is about writing diaries from the perspective of the other. So we ask, for instance, to our doctorate nurses to write a little scenario where they step into the shoes of the other. We want them to train their perspective-taking capacities. We want them to be aware that the other doesn't see things always the way they see things. The other thing that we try to do is we encourage them to think in terms of we rather than in terms of I. So training your we mindset rather than your I mindset. And the last thing that we do with them are what we call interdependencies games. So we ask them to list in the task that they do when and where they need the inputs of the other, to realize that their lives is about being connected, to realize that their lives is about understanding the perspective of the other, it's about understanding the inputs of the other. So what's the bottom line with this talk? Well, many business schools talk about leadership and they all say that we train leader. And when it comes to leadership and leadership styles, you've got two types of leadership. You've got typically what we call the autocratic style of leadership. You don't listen to others, you take your decisions and you impose it onto others. And you've got what we talk the more democratic style of leadership. You listen to others, you take the perspective of the other, and together you take joint decisions. Now, in companies, most companies these days value the democratic style of leadership. But what my research suggests is that it's counterintuitive with the fact that power actually impairs a lot of the skills that you need to be a good interdependent leader, a good democratic leader. So the bottom line for whoever is going to be in a leadership position is be mindful about the consequences of power. Bear in mind that power impairs the capacity to take the perspective of the other. Bear in mind that power impairs your ability to actually respect the norm and encourages you to break the norm. Bear in mind this because this is what will allow you to balance your sense of self, to bring interdependence in. Only if you bring the interdependence back into your self-perception, you'll stay connected to others and you'll be able to be a great democratic leader. Thank you.